The courtroom was tense. Every breath, every glance, every subtle shift of expression carried weight. At the defendant's table sat Marcus Holloway, a tall, well-dressed black man in his mid-40s, his sharp brown eyes scanning the room with a calm intensity. Across from him, two uniformed officers sat confidently, their lawyer smirking, as if the case was already won. Judge Harold Kensington, a man in his late 60s with decades of experience on the bench, leaned forward. "Let's get to it," he said, tapping his gavel. "State your case." The prosecution wasted no time. "Your Honor, my clients, Officers Miller and Dawson, were simply doing their job. They pulled over the defendant, who was speeding. When he refused to comply, they had no choice but to subdue him. Unfortunately, in the struggle, Mr. Holloway resisted, forcing the officers to use necessary force." A chuckle escaped Marcus's lips, low, bitter, disbelieving. "Something funny, Mr. Holloway?" the judge asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just that," Marcus began, his voice even. "It's interesting how much of that is fiction." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The officers shifted uncomfortably, but their lawyer quickly countered. "Your Honor, the defendant is attempting to paint himself as a victim when in reality he was aggressive and uncooperative. The officers even have body cam footage showing him resisting." The judge nodded. "Then let's see the footage." One of the officers fumbled with a flash drive, plugging it into the courtroom's screen. The video started. A dark road, flashing red and blue lights. Marcus's black BMW sat idly, his hands gripping the wheel. The officers approached. "License and registration," Miller barked. Marcus complied, handing over his documents. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Dawson asked, his tone sharp. Marcus frowned. "I live nearby." The officers exchanged glances. Then, suddenly, without provocation, Miller yanked open the door. "Step out of the car!" Marcus hesitated. "What's the reason?" The officers didn't answer. They grabbed him, dragged him out, slammed him against the hood. "Hey!" Marcus started, but his voice was cut off by a hard blow to his ribs. He crumpled, gasping for air. The courtroom was silent. The video ended. The prosecutor cleared his throat, scrambling. "Well, clearly the defendant escalated the situation." "Escalated?" Marcus repeated, standing. His voice carried power now. "Tell me, Your Honor, at what point in that footage did I resist? Because all I saw was an unprovoked assault by two men who believed they could get away with it." Judge Kensington's face remained unreadable. He turned to the officers. "Do you have anything to say for yourselves?" Miller and Dawson stiffened. "Your Honor, we were acting on protocol," Miller stammered. "That's not what I asked," the judge said coolly. The tension was suffocating. Marcus exhaled, then reached into his briefcase, pulling out a sleek black leather folder. He placed it on the table and flipped it open. "This is my employment record," he said, letting his words hang in the air. "My credentials, my service history, my license to practice law in the highest courts of this country." The judge skimmed the document, then froze. His eyes flicked back up to Marcus, shock breaking through his composed mask. Marcus gave a slow nod. "That's right, Your Honor. I am Marcus Holloway, a U.S. attorney. And these officers didn't just attack an innocent man. They assaulted a federal prosecutor." The courtroom exploded into murmurs. The officers paled. The judge cleared his throat, struggling to maintain his usual tone. "Mr. Holloway, why didn't you mention this earlier?" "Would it have mattered?" Marcus countered. "Would you have believed me any more than you believed them? Or would you have dismissed my words just as quickly as you were about to dismiss this case?" The judge's gavel slammed down. "Enough!" He turned to the prosecutor. "Given the evidence presented, I'm dismissing the charges against Mr. Holloway. However," he shifted his gaze to the officers, his tone colder than before, I am also ordering an immediate internal investigation into the conduct of Officers Miller and Dawson. The officers shot to their feet. Your Honor. Sit down. Their lawyer pulled at their arms, whispering harshly. They hesitated, but obeyed. Marcus didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply gathered his documents, straightened his tie, and walked toward the exit. But before he reached the doors, he paused. Then, turning slightly, he looked directly at the judge. Power doesn't come from the robe you wear or the bench you sit on, he said quietly. It comes from the choices you make with it. And with that, he left, leaving behind a courtroom that would never see him the same way again. Judge Kensington sat frozen for a long moment, the weight of Marcus Holloway's words pressing down on him like a gavel of truth. The room was still buzzing, reporters scrambling to take notes, spectators whispering to one another. The officer's lawyer leaned in toward them, hissing something, but their faces had already drained of all color. They knew this wasn't just a simple case anymore. They had laid hands on a federal prosecutor, one with the power and connections to ensure they never wore a badge again. As Marcus stepped out of the courtroom, he was met by a flood of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved toward his face. Mr. Holloway, how do you feel about the judge's ruling? Will you press charges against the officers? Do you believe this case is proof of systemic injustice? Marcus adjusted his tie, his face unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he finally spoke. This case was never just about me, he said. It was about a system that allows men in power to assume guilt before innocence, based solely on appearance. If I weren't a U.S. attorney, this case would have gone very differently. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. So what happens next? One journalist asked. Marcus exhaled, his sharp eyes scanning the reporters. Next? His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable fire beneath it. Next, we make sure this never happens again. He turned and walked away, his steps slow and deliberate. But the case wasn't over. 1 week later, Officer Miller and Officer Dawson sat in the police department's internal affairs office, their nerves shot. The investigation had moved fast, too fast. Normally, officers accused of misconduct had months, sometimes years, before facing serious consequences. But not this time. Not when the man they assaulted had the full backing of the federal government. You're both being placed on unpaid leave, pending further investigation, the department head announced, his voice clipped. The video evidence is damning, and the DA's office is considering criminal charges. Miller's jaw clenched. This is ridiculous! We were doing our job! Were you? The department head shot back. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you assaulted a man without probable cause. And that man just happens to have the resources to make sure you pay for it. Dawson buried his face in his hands. Jesus Christ! Miller swallowed hard. He could already see his career crumbling. He'd gotten away with things like this before. But this time, he had picked the wrong man. Meanwhile, at the U.S. Attorney's office, Marcus stood at his desk, reading the latest report. His phone buzzed. Another message from a civil rights group wanting him to speak at an event. He ignored it. He wasn't interested in speeches. He wanted action. A knock at his door. Come in, he said without looking up. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda, stepped in. You're going to want to see this. She handed him a folder. Marcus flipped it open, and his eyebrows lifted. The judge had filed an official complaint against the officers. He was pushing for harsher consequences than just a suspension. Well, well, Marcus thought. Maybe there was hope for the system after all. He set the file down and leaned back in his chair. The fight wasn't over, but this time, he wasn't fighting alone. What do you think about this case? Do you believe justice was truly served, or do you think more should have been done? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy powerful stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload. Hit that notification bell to stay updated.